On today's episode, we're chatting with Neil Lawrence, the DeepMind Professor of Machine Learning at the University of Cambridge. In this episode, Neil shares with us how our limitations as humans are what makes us unique compared to the machine, how businesses must not lose sight of their core reason for existence when implementing AI. Neil's a total genius in this field, so get ready to expand your thinking. You're going to want to tune in for this one. Neil, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you here on the Fall Forward podcast. Neil Lawrence, you are the DeepMind Professor at the Cambridge University, and if I listed all of the things that you do and have you've done, I think we'd be here for the whole time. It's an incredible experience that you have, Neil, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. So thanks for joining us. For our viewers around the world and members in all the different cities that we're in as Blend, I'd love for them to get to know you a little bit better, Neil, before we dig into your big current project, the book that you have coming out, and the work that you're doing. So perhaps give us a bit of a background to you, Neil. Tell us about what's brought you to where you are and kind of a richness of your experience that you could share with us.
Oh, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I suppose for me, I always wanted to be an engineer from when I was quite young. I quite like building Lego and building things like that. So my dad was a mechanical engineer, and I was quite into cars. I had like their old car, which was a 1974 Triumph 2000 that I used to work on. So I went to university to do mechanical engineering. But I guess when I graduated, I think the state of engineering in the UK was in a pretty poor state, and the job opportunities that were on offer were not great. So I ended up sort of changing direction a bit, going to work on oil rigs for a few years, but then going back to university to do a PhD in an area that's now seen as computer science, but at the time was an emerging area, the area of neural networks and machine learning. And that was sort of mid 1990s. So I ended up with a bit of a shift of direction. And instead of building with physical things, I now build with virtual things. But I guess I have this slightly odd background for a computer scientist in that I feel I'm still a mechanical engineer at heart. I just end up building with a keyboard instead of building with nuts and bolts.
Do you still get to do any mechanical engineering? Do you still have the Triumph, or is it now all focused in the
So the Triumph, I look for it occasionally to see if it still exists. Its license plate was UMU206M. I used to work in an MG garage in the holidays. I've torn the cars totally to pieces. But the amount of time it takes to set up to work on an old car is a lot more than it takes to set up to work on a piece of computer code.
Where do you think this need or this kind of this passion for you of building and fixing comes from? Is that something you just were born with, or it was learned from the kind of environment you were in?
I guess it's curiosity and creation. I think a lot of people have it in different ways, and it's probably a function of, I think we all enjoy completing things. You get a little dopamine hit from that, and I guess how we complete them is a little bit dependent on what we enjoy and what we're good at, and those two interrelate. It's hard to know exactly how it's different for different people, but I think for me, it's really that. And also, I think I find it very absorbing. I used to spend a lot of time just quietly sitting there playing with Lego in the basement. We lived in the US for a while, so we had this basement with all this Lego across it. And in some sense, when I can find the time, and I do try and make the time today, I get an enormous amount of tranquility about spending a lot of time with code, as long as I'm not debugging. But when I feel I'm creating and it's working, I can get back to that same sense. And I think there's something particularly nice about being in a world. You see it on YouTube a lot with a lot of creators who are in these worlds where they imagine what they're going to build and they get to realize that. And I just think that's a very satisfying process. Of course, in the real world, we tend to work with other people to create things, and that's a lot more complex. Working with people is harder than working with things, but has its own interest and challenges and rewards. But of course, by its very nature, it if we're doing it well, it's not entirely within our control. And I think building things or maybe creating a painting is something which feels more within our individual control. So there's a different form of satisfaction.
Yeah, absolutely. So then let's kind of bring us a bit further forward, Neil. So currently, DeepMind professor at the University of Cambridge. But before that, tell us a bit about your background, because moving into the world of education and research and learning. Before that, you were at Amazon and Microsoft and in industry. So tell us that background, and then tell us why you kind of took the step into that space.
Yeah, so I'd gone to work on oil rigs, and I was reading about neural networks on oil rigs. This is in the sort of mid 1990s, 94, 95, 96. And I was doing things with acquiring data that I knew it was difficult for computers to work with the data, to do the interpretation that the geologists I was working with were interested in. And I ended up reading The New Scientist. There wasn't really a very large internet. You're stuck on an oil rig, so you look for reading material. It's not the most common reading material on an oil rig, but you can buy The New Scientist and take it onto an oil rig. And I read about these things called neural networks, and that really intrigued me. So I ended up going to do a PhD. But for me, going to do a PhD, I had no academic background in my family. My dad was the first in the family to go to university, and he focused on engineering. We had no academic background in the family. There was no sense in that a PhD was a route to becoming an academic. It was a route to finding out more about these very interesting sounding mathematical techniques that could do things that I knew you couldn't do normally with computers. So when I graduated, I was very keen to sort of go back into industry and use these techniques. It's almost like it's a repeat history of my graduation. I graduated in a subject and no one in industry is interested in it. So at the time, the only company that was paying any interest was Microsoft. And my PhD supervisor was at Microsoft Research in Cambridge. But also because it's a sort of this weird thing to continue working with your supervisor. Maybe it shouldn't be weird, but it's considered not super healthy to stay in that relationship. It's a particular form of relationship. I mean, it can work. So I only worked for Microsoft Research for a year, and then realized if I wanted to carry on doing this, I needed to stay in the university. So I moved to the University of Sheffield. But because I was sort of always in this mode of I'm interested in these things and how they deploy and how they solve problems, sort of 15 years later, when these techniques were working and the conversation had shifted and everyone was desperate to recruit people who had these skills into companies, I looked around and took the opportunity to go to the place that I thought I would learn the most about what the challenges were in deployment. And that was Amazon. So I had this year at Microsoft Research. It was incredibly difficult to deploy machine learning due to the timelines it took to build software in those days. But 15 years later, the timelines of continuous deployment meant that machine learning was being widely deployed. And so I went into Amazon and spent 3 years as director of machine learning, focusing mainly on the supply chain, but doing other things as well, and really learning what the pros and pitfalls are of these techniques when deployed. Because I think that goes back to my sort of desire to do engineering, to understand how to fix things. And fixing things requires you to deploy them. There's a lot of people who sit there speculating about deployments. And yes, occasionally you get something out of that, but it's 1 in 1,000. Most of the time your speculations are just wrong. And actually, when it does work, it can be quite problematic because, yes, it's worked, but you haven't considered the negative consequences of it working.
Yeah.
And that's a big problem. And I think it's a big problem in our field at the moment. So I was always keen to focus on how deployments work. And indeed, towards the latter end of that 15 years I spent in Sheffield, started working with colleagues in Africa who were doing a lot of deployments. So we're well ahead of the Western ecosystem because they were deploying real solutions, helping monitor crops or build health systems in ecosystems where pre-existing systems didn't exist. So I started collaborating with them and learned an enormous amount, and sort of hoped to go to Amazon to consolidate that education, to find out the gaps, to find out the things that Amazon knew that my colleagues in Africa hadn't had access to, so I could take them back into the field and teach them. And yet I found it was the other way around. I found that I knew more that I'd learned from my colleagues in Africa than most of my colleagues in Amazon knew about deployments. Of course, I learned things. I learned quite a lot about big systems, but I learned they didn't have solutions, that the things I saw were problems were not things that they'd solved, and the way that they were addressing them was just by recruiting more people, something that my colleagues in Africa couldn't afford to do.
Yeah.
And that's sort of been one of the big drivers of my ongoing research, is how do we put that right? Because there's this buried problem that, Amazon runs an automated supply chain, but it runs it with 2,000 highly paid software engineers. Google runs this massive advertising ecosystem, but to do it, it has thousands of highly paid software engineers. And this is a big problem for society, because for the rest of us to get access to these techniques, we can't afford to pay inordinate amounts to these sort of rare breeds of software engineers. And that's a big blocker on the way in which this technology can be deployed, and also who controls the technology. So that's something that I've been sort of thinking about for the last 10 years, but have been addressing specifically in my research in the last 5 years. Because I got to the sort of point at Amazon, it was great. I liked it. I learned a lot, but I knew I couldn't achieve the sort of things. It wasn't the right place to address this problem. They hadn't addressed it themselves about how do you deploy these large scale complex software systems in a way that doesn't require thousands of software engineers. They'd be interested in the solution, but the solution requires working across academia and industry and requires a lot of thought. So I returned to academia in 2019, really to focus on that challenge. And that's what my main research challenge has been since.
Really interesting. You mentioned that kind of sharing of ideas and lots of learnings and I'm sure lots of failures that come through that. That's obviously a big part of our theme around the Fall Forward podcast, is learning from those failures and taking them forward into that. And so I'd perhaps love to kind of then explore a little bit about the next step for you, which is you're obviously about to release your book, The Atomic Human. So tell me about the book. Tell me about the reason that you wrote the book and kind of the overarching theme behind the book for listeners who perhaps aren't aware yet of the book.
It's been a major sort of part of my life about a decade. And I think that there's so many different answers that are all true. Almost the first one I'm going for, given what we've just sort of spoken about, the background given, is it was a form of therapy to deal with the trauma of what I could see was happening to my field. I suddenly realized, there were people around me who weren't doing this in the same way I was doing it. They weren't trying to solve problems. They had this notion that solving intelligence, I guess is the way that DeepMind put it, was a thing. And that just reconstructing things that were humans for the sake of constructing things for humans was a thing. And of course, I know that people think about that, and it's a sort of thing in science fiction. But there'd been these breakthroughs in machine learning coming from neural networks, exactly the models that I'd been studying back in the day on the oil rigs, that were showing that we could suddenly do a few things that we hadn't been able to do before. In this case, recognize objects in images. And it was almost like a signal. It was like some sort of bat signal or the dark mark or something. I don't know, whatever you want to, whichever way you see it, to rally people who'd been working in the field for a number of years and perhaps been doing some applications, but actually sort of fundamentally believed that it was a sensible objective to try and reconstruct intelligence, or that that's what we'd been doing. And by taking on that mantle, that title, it was interesting because we inherited that objective of the AI community, which was not an objective I or many of my colleagues have been pursuing. So it was very interesting because I was and still am an expert. There were very few experts. I think still there's relatively few experts, but there's a lot of people who claim expertise in this domain. A lot of people who've been talking about it for a number of years. So you're suddenly an expert and you're being asked about the future of AI. So you need answers and sensible answers for both the public and policymakers about what's going on, what's possible, what isn't. You need to understand the perspective of those whose philosophy is different from yours. You need to take a step back. I was observing a conversation that I thought was poor quality. I was hearing from colleagues who I thought were quite naive in some of the things they were saying about domains they didn't understand. And I felt that maybe I could contribute to that conversation. So I started focusing on public understanding of these technologies over the next couple of years. After that, writing for The Guardian, giving schools talks. I focused a lot on going into schools. I already had been actually for a couple of years, ever since I became a full professor, of going into schools and talking to children about computer science and machine learning. It's just a wonderful privilege to do it, and like across all ages. And those things sort of started coming together with what was, I think, a very misdirected conversation at that time. I was very nervous that people were missing the real risks. What I saw as the real problem was that what I called the digital oligarchy in one of my articles, that is about control of personal data being held by very few entities and losing control of our own destiny and us through those entities. Not even necessarily doing anything evil. I mean, I think conspiracy is rare. Clumsiness and incompetence is common.
Yeah.
So you give a few companies control of large amounts of data, and clumsiness and incompetence follows. And I deeply feared that was going to happen and that we weren't talking about it. Now, of course, it did happen. It happened before I could get anything out into the public. So in some sense, that first wave, I'd failed to get ahead of it because it happened so quickly. But I still had the material. And after that, I'd gone to Amazon and started focusing on what the real world deployment was. And still this sort of question came. Well, it still felt that the conversation actually improved a lot over those years because we got a lot of good people into government, a lot of good people advising government. The UK is extremely lucky with the diversity of expertise, both on the technical side, the socio-technical side, the legal side, the capabilities we have. When I compare it to my colleagues in Uganda, who basically they're growing that community. I sort of operate as a patron for them, but they're growing that community themselves. Some of them visit and see what we do. We were so lucky, and we brought this great group together, different groups, the AI Council, the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation. And these entities really started laying down the foundations of some of the things we needed to do. But the book was trying to go deeper and sort of share the lessons that I could see coming from that and explain why some of these very simplistic things that tend to catch the public imagination because they come from science fiction. So they form these narratives which are necessarily attractive to people. They make films, but sort of explain to people, well, that's, it's much more interesting than science fiction can possibly portray. Of course, there's ideas in science fiction that are interesting and worth thinking about, but don't get distracted too much by those ideas. When people sort of tell you the future is going to be this simplistic thing, that has never happened. That has never happened, right?
Yes.
I mean, it can be used as an interesting thing to think about, to sort of, why might it not happen? I think it's useful to think that, what will go wrong, or how does that actually happen in practice? But the book was then sort of about taking this understanding and knowledge, and it was written a second time. So it was written once in draft form before Cambridge Analytica, and then rewritten a second time sort of just after Amazon, combining the understanding of how things were being deployed with this background understanding of the data economy, the digital oligarchy itself. And then it was written a third time. So it's like triple fermented.
Third time lucky, but I think we spoke a little while ago about some of the themes and topics in the book, and before we kind of touch on the next part I was going to ask you about. I'd like to pause on that. The piece that you mentioned around the assumed leadership responsibility of those companies who are leading the AI charge because of the data that they hold on the mass populace. I read a piece around, I think it was Mo Godwat, who I was listening to not that long ago, who was talking about, the leaders of these companies never go through the rigor or the public domain that perhaps leaders of countries do. And yet they have now assumed responsibility for so much of our lives. And I think that's just a really interesting conversation because, as you point out, that there's a huge amount of risk in that. There's a huge amount of challenge in that. But there's potentially also a huge amount of opportunity for humanity in that, if the right people are doing the right thing. So I'd love to just dig a bit deeper with you there and just kind of get your view on what the state of that is and what might happen over the next couple of years.
So my view is that companies are very unsophisticated. They are probably the least sophisticated institution that we have in society. And that's their strength. It's also their weakness. Society is almost indulgent of companies in the way parents are indulgent of children. We allow companies to do things that we would never let other institutions get away with. Groups of teachers or the medical profession or defense. All these other institutions have moral obligations that are more equivalent to the obligations we expect of other adults. Yet companies, because it allows them to be more efficient, are allowed to sort of drop some of their moral obligations. It's almost sort of explicit in the way they're set up and forge forward, just creating shareholder value. Now, the reason that's important for society, and I don't want to say that shouldn't exist, is because it allows us to reduce the sort of load of moral computation, which is one of the hardest forms of trust between us. And there's lots of mechanisms we have. Money is another example of something that allows us, I do something for you. If we're not exchanging money in smaller groups, you would have had a social obligation towards me. And that scale of calculating against those different social obligations is actually quite challenging and difficult. It's much harder. It involves a lot more. If we just turn it into, but I paid you $10 and you can give this $10, that's all become transactional. And that allows things to scale a lot more and it allows a lot of efficiencies, but it removes some of the nuance of the sort of social obligation.
Yeah.
And companies, in effect, we've allowed them to do that for very sensible reasons. It allows us to do a number of things in society. But you mentioned the idea of leadership earlier. And the thing I keep saying about leadership is, for me, leadership means showing the way forward and enabling others to follow. Under that definition, none of these companies are leading. None of their leaders, from a societal perspective, are leading. Their leaders are leading in the interests of the company. And the company itself being an entity that is indulged by society in the way a child is indulged. So what we have is a situation where these companies are also extremely powerful because they make their founders or owners very wealthy. There's a lot of interest in the economic benefits they bring, which we should not underestimate. It's an incredibly important part of modern society. But I think the point you're making is to do with what I think has been the sort of worldwide global degradation of the public sector and public purpose in this sort of vision that this sort of childlike way of proceeding, that we just have to all make more money, is all we need, when it clearly and obviously isn't, because there are a number of vital institutions. And if you'd ask anyone about the problems that they most care about, it's probably education, healthcare, it might well be security. The most important things in society, we do not allow them to behave in the way that we allow companies to behave. So this is very, very difficult, because it's not that the company leaders are badly intentioned. It's not that they're, or maybe they are, but they don't even have to be badly intentioned or evil or anything else. They're just not being subject to the sort of moral obligations that we would normally expect such sensitive technologies. There's a sort of sense, or there has been a sense in the more naive in government, that the only people that can fix the problem are the people that are causing the problem. And I think this is coming, again, not because our leaders aren't intelligent. As you said before, that our leaders, the political leaders, are subject to an extraordinarily large number of conflicting demands. And, they have to go through what they're about to go through in the UK, getting elected, which is, imagine any company leader managing to do that, and then also being a really great leader and staying on top of the technology and everything else. And so I look at that, of course, I find it frustrating when you're working in that area, frustrating when you're seeing very naive people being given very powerful positions. It's frustrating for the whole community. But you've got two choices. You either sort of scream about that on social media and make the divisions greater, because the naive people aren't stupid, and they themselves need to be carried along with a better vision for society. And I don't think going and screaming at them on social media is helpful. Or you can try and construct something that you think is your best attempt to lay out the parameters as you see them, the reason why you think it's more nuanced, in the best manner in which you can, in the way that brings the most nuance to the conversation you can. I hope the book is written in ways that everyone can understand, because my primary belief is that in order to make the best of these technologies, you rightly said, there's all these opportunities for these technologies. We need to get normal people, regular folk, cognition with what the issues are so that they can make their voice heard. Because the leaders, or the so-called leaders, as I've said before, I don't think they're not societal leaders. They may be leading companies. They're not leading society. I mean, in the way that I described, showing the way forward, enabling others to follow. They're not enabling others to follow. They're trying to block others from following.
Yes.
The way forward they're showing is that's in the interest of their shareholders, not because they're evil, not because, that they're a bad part of society that we should eliminate, but just because that's what we expect companies to do. And the mechanisms which we sort of pull them back in, companies are our children that we're very proud of. And the mechanisms we have for sort of when they overstep the mark are just not in place at the moment for these very large companies. And what we need to get those mechanisms in place is to build the broader public understanding of what the issues are, which will also support those leaders in developing their understanding. Some of the things they're doing are out of ignorance. They themselves are not that cognizant of the social issues.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where the target of the book is, trying to sort of, having said all that, at the end of it, I go, well, that's stupidly ambitious. And there's just no possible way it could achieve it. And it's even arrogant to even think about it. But I suppose I just felt you have to give everything your best shot, and I was just in this really odd position of having seen these different things. And, so in some sense, my book is the best shot at trying to do that idiotically ambitious thing.
Well, I always enjoy books full of ideas. And I think if nothing more, if it stimulates others to be more considerate about the actions that they're taking in this field, then you've achieved your aim, Neil, for sure. I think one of the things that I think in the book that you talk about is around the role of course, the human, right? And AI and machine learning, as you have told us all about, and others, it's been here for ages. This isn't a new field, but it's the access, the ability for everyone, myself, the 14-year-old kids in their garages, having access to ChatGPT and others, that has changed the landscape. So in this world that now is being taken over by AI, you hear it everywhere in almost every conversation, what makes us unique as humans in this age of AI?
That's great, because that goes back to exactly what I hope holds the whole book together, because that's the question it asks. So the book's called The Atomic Human because it has this notion, the notion that is derived from Democritus's atom. So Democritus's atom, or the atomism of Democritus, was this idea that you take something in the physical world, you cut it in half, you take one half of that, and then you cut it again, and you take one half of that, and you cut it again. And eventually the thought is, if you keep doing that, you get to a position where you can't cut. And the atomists said yes, and they called that the atom. And that's the sort of the origin of our term atom today, which is coming from physics, which of course you can split. But that's where the notion comes from. Now, so the notion of the atomic human is to ask that same question, but for our cognitive world. So if every time the machine does something that we formerly thought of as very specific to humans, it's cutting something away from us cognitively. Indeed, the machine has cut things away from us physically, like, we have robots that build cars. So every time that happens, it's sort of somehow cutting us in the way of Democritus's atom. The question is there a point that you can't cut? And that's the notion of the atomic human. And that's what pulls this crazily ambitious book together, is to sort of ask that question and then center everything I'm talking about around that idea. And the answer to that question comes in chapter 1 is, there is something that can't be cut. It'd be a short book if there wasn't. It'd be, it's gone, done. Bye-bye, human. But the point about the book is the thing that can't be cut. And I think that this is why I do have this hope that the book may achieve some of the things that I hope for it, is not our capabilities. It's not something like, it's not our ability to play chess or drive a car or whatever else. It's always possible that can be done better. It's always possible you can have a robot car that can go faster than Lewis Hamilton, just like you can have a chess machine that can beat Kasparov, or a Go machine that can beat Lee Sedol. Whatever capability, whatever of these wonderful achievements from these extraordinary people you can come up with, it's possible that you can have a computer do it better. But those achievements of Lee Sedol or Lewis Hamilton are not just amazing because of their capabilities. They're amazing because of their limitations and their vulnerabilities. When you take Lewis Hamilton, he's risking his life to drive around a circuit at 200 miles an hour using a visual system that has a bandwidth of various estimates between 1 and 10 megabits per second, which is, like a thousandth of that of your camera, turning into corners at high speed. If you were to build a machine that would do that directly, the amount of data it could read about the car, Lewis Hamilton is sensing a frequency of 50 hertz through his bum as he goes around those corners, choosing when to turn into an individual corner. The fact that he's a sort of limited human in the way of you and I, and yet he's capable of doing those things, is what makes it amazing. And it's those limitations and vulnerabilities that are the irreplaceable parts of those humans and what we do to overcome them. And so that's really what the book is about. It sort of talks about the history of the development of the computer, where these technologies come from, but it's constantly doing it through the eyes of the people that developed them, that developed the machine, how they collaborated, how they worked together, what they were trying to achieve. So the book really does something that I sort of observed in works that I admired. It tries to say, well, AI is a place to stand and look back at humans and understand our intelligence and understand what we want and change the conversation away from one which is about what AI is going to do to one that sort of says, well, hang on a minute, what's special about us and what do we want to preserve and how are we going to maintain that? And that came from another of the motivations for wanting to write the book, that just noticing back about 10 years ago, I ended up writing a blog post about it, that the conversation around AI kind of looks like a very simplistic conversation around Greek gods. So I used to love reading Greek myth, the Olympian gods, sort of all fighting each other and being jealous of each other, and then heroes becoming immortal or becoming demigods. And, the similarity between these stories and people wanting to upload their brains or become immortal or saying that the AI is going to try and kill us all. It's this wonderful anthropomorphization of an intelligence that is beyond you. So you sort of see, oh, well, if there are gods that have created the world, but of course they're just going to be like us. They're going to want to, they're going to turn themselves into cows and sleep with beautiful women to get away from their wife, the sort of thing that Zeus is all up to. This sort of inability to project to an intelligence that is beyond us, which is as I explain in the book, which is a very natural part of the human intelligence. Our human intelligence requires us to understand other humans, so we always interpret other intelligences as human-like.
Yes.
And then we project that onto our gods, and you get Greek myths. Now, that made me think, oh, how do we get to somewhere that's a bit more productive? And I'm not religious myself, but there are things I admire about religious people. And one of the things I admire is the ability to sort of take that thought and turn it into, well, if God is all powerful and there's this intelligence beyond my imagination, what does that mean for me and my intelligence and my failings? So you can see that that's the same sort of thing I'm trying to do in the book, but using the notion of other intelligences, which under the only way that we can objectively measure them, which is information transfer rate, are millions of times more powerful than us already, and have been before we developed these neural network capabilities. They were already like that. And that's what drove the digital oligarchy. That's what's giving the vast power to these few companies. But to then be able to say, okay, so from that perspective, can we look back at our intelligence and move away from this narcissism, I think, is associated with the word intelligence, which is associated with, I think, many of the more simplistic commentators on the nature of intelligence. It's like, oh, well, intelligence, I'm intelligent, and we need to build intelligences like me, and such an intelligence would therefore want to take over the world. Let's all run and scream, which I think is, really reflecting the sort of narcissism. But there's this spectrum between narcissism and introspection, right?
Yeah.
And we could push the debate to introspection, and that introspection becomes like a communal reflection on what we want as humans, and realize it's not just about me, it's about a diversity of different people, not all of whom enjoy playing with Lego, not all of whom bought MGB GTs, not all of whom have the same capabilities as we do, and trying to bring them along in a conversation about what we want these technologies to do.
I really like that joining point, because if I think about most of the people watching this podcast, they're leaders of large organizations across the world, responsible for 75-80% of what happens in our lives day to day. And the point that you mentioned there around, the diversity of people inputting into these systems, at the moment that's pretty limited. We were joking. I was joking with someone the other week that how many people called a middle-aged white guy called Colin creating code for and working in machine learning whose biases are being directly inputted into the models. And so being cognizant about what you want to achieve with AI, with a model, is probably a step that we haven't taken as society. And this, of course, is the point that you're raising around that. But as a leader, if you're in these organizations, what advice would you give to them to say, well, look, as you're applying these, and the pressure on them is huge, of course, to apply, everyone needs to apply AI in their business tomorrow, whether it's right or wrong. But what advice would you give them? What would you say, look, these are the things that you should really be considering to avoid a pitfall later in the road?
So I give fairly consistent advice on this because I've seen, and I think we can even go back to the development of the internet as the sort of challenges. And you're totally right. What I'm saying about these organizations, I don't want to sort of mean that their jobs are easy or anything like that. They're incredibly difficult, high pressure roles. I think what happens, so I do a lot of work with the Judge Business School. So if you really want to know all my answers, you have to be one of their advanced leadership programs. But the summary at the end of that program I give is all about not giving up on your business instincts. So leaders are leaders because they have intuitions. And the book actually talks a lot about this balance. It looks a lot at, it's being released on the anniversary of D-Day, 80th anniversary, and it uses Eisenhower a lot as an example of a leader. And it talks a lot about the way that a leader has to devolve autonomy to people, and it trusts that those people are going to do the things, and how leaders have to focus on culture, that they do the right thing. Now, the reason why these technologies are so difficult is because if they're going to be absorbed by a company, if they're going to be absorbed well, they're fundamentally changing what I call the information topography of the organization. So the information topography is the way that knowledge moves around the company. and one of the points the book makes is one of the human limitations, almost our defining limitation, is our limited bandwidth versus the machine. The machine has between 30 and 300 million times higher bandwidth, depending on which gigabit form of Ethernet you have. So when you've got that level of much lower level of bandwidth, humans get around that by sharing cultural knowledge and cultural awareness. We do that across our societies, and businesses do that by coming up with often simpler cultures than wider society. Amazon, for example, uses leadership principles, and you teach culture instead of teaching actions. So what you do is you teach culture and you empower people, and then you say to those people, you're now aware of the culture, go and do your job in the knowledge of this culture. Now, this presents multiple problems because these new technologies effectively allow an interface between the human and the machine. And the nature of that interface is one where the human is getting access to the much higher bandwidth world that the machine has. So I can talk to a machine, and the machine can go out there with its 300 million times more information and come back, hopefully, with an answer. It might hallucinate. The hallucination is just a very human characteristic, and it's picking up these human characteristics by reading everything we've done. So we have to deal with that sort of thing. But it's suddenly changing the source of information in the way that the internet did, and the way in which we can get that information. And of course, internet, as we heard with Microsoft, where I was, where it took 2 years to deploy a product, versus Amazon, where we were continuously deploying, radically changed the information infrastructure, as will artificial intelligence. There's a few things going on. And you can look back at companies that tried to react to the internet quickly, like Marconi, and they went running after what they saw as the future, and they were right, but they also went bankrupt because they lost their basic business sense in doing so. The problem is no one knows what that world is going to look like. And you go charging off your imagined view of that world. It's the same as what we were saying before. It's the naive view of the way things will be is always wrong. So you chase that naive vision, which is, the vision of any one of the sort of people who are being most quoted at the moment, because media tends to quote the simplest, most naive sounding thing. If you chase that vision, you're just chasing bankruptcy. And that's the pressure, though, leaders are under. And you're seeing it across multiple companies. You hear it, people talk to me about AI all the time, about what's going on in their business. It's widespread. And it becomes because senior leadership in these companies don't understand the technology. They believe what they're reading in the press, and they're putting pressure on their teams to deliver an AI-enabled company. And they're losing all their business sense. So one of the examples I give to try and get business leaders to understand this problem is, I guess many of your listeners will have seen this video where you're asked to count people passing basketballs between each other. And you're so focused on counting these basketballs that you don't notice a person in a gorilla suit walk across the background and beat their chest and walk off.
Yes.
And it's an inattention bias, or it's an attention bias. You're so focused on one thing that you ignore the other. Now, this is where all businesses are going right now. They're so focused on what they're going to do in AI, something that they don't understand. So they don't express good judgment over it, but they're happy to listen to the snake oil salespeople and sort of buy into that and say, we must do this, that they forget to look out for gorillas. Because they kept being told by people coming in, this is AI, it's very difficult, you're not going to understand this, blah, blah, blah. And so they're really focused on this thing that this person's trying to say, like the counting of the basketballs. And there's this gorilla in the background that this is nothing to do with their business, that this isn't going to give them a business advantage, that everyone else is having the same conversation. And they're not going to deploy these capabilities quicker than anyone else. And they can't lose sight of what their gorilla is and why that's their gorilla, and that they're in that relationship with the gorilla. And everything should be subservient to that. That's my advice to business leaders, because fundamentally, that's the error you see again and again and again around any technology. And it comes because the senior leaders, any disruptive technology, I'd say, not any technology, any disruptive new technology, because what happens is that leaders are relying on intuition and instinct and the smell of things, which they've built up through long experience in their business area, if they're good leaders in that sense.
Yes.
And they don't have the business instinct on this. They can't smell it.
Yeah.
And what they actually need to do is develop that intuition or develop good trust between people who have that intuition. But that takes time, and they're being pressurized to rush. So what they tend to do is go all in or all out. The all in is, yes, this is our future, let's go for it 100%. That's the leader who's doing this for the first time. The next time you meet that leader, they're all out because their business blew up or their org blew up. So they don't want anything to do with this ever again. And of course, the truth is between those things. And this is what experienced humans who spent time with the technology are like. And, going back to the sort of what happened in UK policy, you've exactly seen that over the last year and a half. We were all out and then we were all in. It was all about AI safety. And now it's all about businesses again, because you ended up being dominated for a period by people who didn't understand the technology. And so they felt obliged to make rapid decisions. Now, fortunately, we are not led in a corporate style. Fortunately, we have a robust civil service that has a lot of expertise, and eventually the truth surfaces up, which is, I think, why you sort of hope that policy becomes, and like you see signs of that we're getting a bit back to a few more sensible things now. But companies, I think, are less like that because they have this different nature, and they can be allowed to collapse. We can't allow our health service, education, etc., to collapse. And so companies are very vulnerable to collapse when this happens. And so that's kind of the thing to look out for. So the advice is, don't take your eye off the gorilla. You be constantly worrying about the thing that punches you in the mouth. The sort of Mike Tyson's maxim is, like, I talk again about this in the book. The real world punches you in the mouth. The real world will do things. You know your customers. You listen to your customers. You see what they're doing. Yes, these technologies can help, but you need to be led by your product and your business's mission. And these technologies need to be in service for that. Of course, that's totally different if you're an AI startup who's just pushing these technologies. But, we have these lessons. We have them from the development of the computer when that first came out, from the arrival of the internet, and for the arrival of AI. We see it again and again and again. It's absolutely true. There will be new entrants, greenfield businesses that do amazing things with this technology that everyone will go, oh, and why didn't we do that? Well, because your culture wasn't set up for that, and that wasn't your business. And if you had gone in that direction, you would have bankrupted yourself. I mean, so there's two sort of parts to the thing. One is, what's going to happen in 10 years' time? And the answer to that is, you'll want your corporate culture to be quite different from what it is today.
Yeah.
But how you get there is, like all cultures, is not something you can change overnight, and something you want to think carefully about as you change it. Two is, what does one do in the near term in terms of all the sort of snake oil sales, I call it the Bitcoin era of AI, where everyone's telling you need to do everything. There's all this confusion going on. Well, you don't lose sight of your North Star, which is, why is your business doing what it's doing? What's its strategy, and how are these technologies going to support that strategy? Your North Star isn't AI for most businesses. Yes. Your North Star is whatever you set up to do this thing before, and AI is just a technology to guide you in that direction.
Such practical advice, Neil, and I love the analogy around keeping your eye on the gorilla, because so I mean, we've seen it time and time again, haven't we, through different innovations, and people often talk about the blockbuster story and others. That's a great example of where people were, keep not looking out for the gorilla and paying their time and attention on what their customers really wanted and what their customers really needed. There's two things in the podcast that we always do. One is to have a question from our members. So perhaps you can give us an answer to that, which is, what scares you most about AI and what excites you most about AI? That was the question we had from our membership.
So what scares me most about AI and what excites me most about AI is almost conflated as the same thing. It's potential for societal transformation. And that could go in two ways. One of the things we love to do is gripe about what's wrong with society. Yet, when people try and fix the things they perceive as wrong, it often has unintended consequences, because all the bits of society that are actually functioning in this extremely complicated way. Society is like an ecosystem, and I make this point in the book, that there's all this stuff going on that's just working. And then when you intervene thinking, well, I'll just do this, I'll just get rid of that then, that's not working. There's all these unintended consequences because there's all this stuff that was just bubbling along nicely you didn't know about. And so what I fear most is if we listen to these overly simplistic voices who tend to be in the groups that haven't noticed how complex society is and think, well, it's all about, I just create AI computers and they solve everything. Solve intelligence and then solve everything else. I mean, there you go. It's just not going to work that way. So that I fear that those people who are dominating currently, with the regulators, then I don't use the word empowered because they're not educated. The regulators need to sort of understand these technologies and understand exactly the thing we just said about businesses, but for the regulators, how do they use and regulate AI in what is their objective, which is to bring the best out of these capabilities for the wider society. If we don't manage to get there because we're so obsessed with the sort of things that we're hearing in the media at the moment, I think we're heading for not just a dystopia, but societal existential risk.
I was going to say, and then the final question for you is, we always ask our guests to give a recommendation, something, it can be anything, frankly. It could even be a meal you had yesterday, but something that you think would be interesting for our members, a recommendation that you would give to everybody. If you haven't done it, go and do this thing, or read this thing, or buy this thing, whatever it might be.
Oh, go for a walk in the hill.
I like that, Neil. That's great.
Find yourself. I go for a walk every morning and try and think through the balance of these things. What is important? It's the urgent important thing, isn't it? I know that's a sort of cliche, but it's so true. And, just in terms of what we've just been saying about AI, everyone's being told it's urgent, but the important thing is keeping that eye on the business and spending that time and space going for a walk or whatever it is, whatever it gives you time to think and reflect, and making sure you have that time in your day is, to me, the most important thing. And it's so hard to defend it because people are going, oh, yeah, I just saw you out for a walk. yeah, you did.
I think that's such a lovely way to finish, Neil, and making sure you're giving yourself the time to consider the context. I think so much of what we've talked about today is reflecting, giving yourself the space to really view things properly as a leader, whether you're in politics, whether you're a policymaker, whether you're in academia, whether you're in the professional world of all our listeners. Maintaining that space to just consider if these are the right things, stop and pause and have a walk. So I love that way to finish. Neil, it's so interesting talking to you. I think we could talk for days probably about these things. We can't wait to see the book as it comes out, and we'll. I think we're going to do a book club review with you, which is really exciting. So our members will be able to learn more about that. And we wish you well with the launch. We wish you well with all things that you've got up and coming. And we look forward to seeing you, well, I'm sure soon again, if we can. And thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your time in Italy. Enjoy your trip.
Thanks, Stephen. A pleasure as always. Great to see you.
Make sure you subscribe to the 4 Forward channel so you don't miss any new episodes. I'll see you soon.